Well, it is that time of the show now where we look at the stories that made headlines this week. Well, let's give you a list of at least what we thought made headlines this week, or major talking points. President Cyril Ramphosa making a state visit to the United Kingdom, and among the people he met there, King Charles III. We'll also look at the Supreme Court of Appeal ruling that set aside former President Jacob Zuma's medical parole, including that other important ruling coming out of the Concourt, which remains or continues to be a major talking point. Chris Hani's killer, Janusz Walus, who is granted parole, and at least the expectation is that he is going to be let out of prison soon. And one of the last stories we're going to talk about is the ongoing strike by public servants. They are demanding a pay rise, government saying 3% is the only amount we can afford. So let's speak to political analyst and TK Pooe. He is with the Wits School of Governance. We were hoping to be joined by another political analyst, and unfortunately that person couldn't join us. So TK, it's you and I who are going to look through these stories. Let's start with President Ramaphosa going to the United Kingdom, and it does appear that he has made some trade deals, including bringing, hopefully, investment into the country. How do you see that state visit?
Well, look, I think it's needed. I mean, I think judging from, the 2022 numbers state that I think we've got about 10.6 billion pounds worth of investments, trade between South Africa and the UK. So it's a strategic partner to have. However, what would be interesting is that, have they really looked at what the UK represents post-Brexit? And if you judge where the UK economy is at the moment, have they done the proper numbers to say, listen, this is what we want, and can we get maximum back? Because as you know, previously, what's made it hard to negotiate with the UK in the EU is that they had to negotiate as a bloc, and they always used to get preferential treatment. And we're seeing other countries such as India and even China actually really looking at how they relate with the UK so that they can get maximum back. So I'm hoping our president and his advisors were able to get the maximum benefit for us in investment terms. It didn't simply revert to what has been happening over the last 2 decades.
Yeah, at least that's the benefit for South Africa. TK, let me tell you that Matlala Setlhalogile also joining this conversation. He is the other person we are adding to the conversation. Matlala, good morning to you, and thank you for joining in. And we are talking about the president's visit to the United Kingdom, the state visit to the United Kingdom. So while South Africa looked to benefit out of this visit, the UK as well did have some expectations of South Africa, and a major talking point globally at the moment is what is going on in Ukraine, and we know South Africa's relationship with Russia. Talk to us about how he has likely navigated that conversation.
Morning, Tole, and thanks for having me, Tole. Tole, I think TK touched on some very important aspects in terms of the trade relations between the UK and South Africa. Just to add to what he said before I come to your question, I think South Africa is the biggest trading partner to the UK in Africa. You'd remember that South Africa's industrial policy is intrinsically linked to its trade policy. The bigger the trade, the more opportunities, job opportunities are created. You'd remember that diplomatic relations are multifaceted. There's cultural aspects to them, there's trade aspects, there's economic diplomacy. In as much as politically, the current state visit to the UK by our president might not come at the right time, but there's still strategic ties that needs to be harnessed going forward in order to address South Africa's national interests. And at the center of our national interest is the triple challenges, which is poverty, inequalities, and unemployment. And trade plays a very huge part in ensuring that we eradicate those triple challenges. But in terms of the issue of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as I indicated, that diplomatic relations are multifaceted. two nations do not necessarily have to agree on every aspect in terms of what is happening around the globe. Even though that they might take different positions and actually have different standpoints on the matter of Ukraine and Russia, they still have another facet, which to Hannes, as I indicated earlier, the economic diplomacy part of the SA-UK relations.
Let's bring back TK. TK, I'm going to move on from this subject of the state visit, but Matlala raises a very important aspect, and that is the triple challenges that South Africa faces: poverty, unemployment, and inequality. What hinges on these being addressed is that you've got to have an economy that is at least functioning at a rate or growing at a rate that can create jobs. How do you do that with the energy insufficiency that the country is experiencing at the moment? I'm saying this because the president again touched on the just energy transition in the United Kingdom, and this seems to have been at least a standout point for me.
Yes, it is. I think you put it quite nicely, because I hear the new term floating around is energy insufficiency. I think we should be very clear. We should just be saying the fact that the government has bundled for the last 2 decades the energy problem. We're not here because of areas. We're here because the ANC, when it was told to invest in energy, did not do so. So I think we should never lose sight of it. Look, this just transition, in theory, it sounds very nice, but I think we haven't really worked out the finer mechanics. And here I'm speaking about the fact that, look, I always say let's compare our peers, because there's one thing to compare ourselves to the UK and the US. They've just got different considerations. But if you look at our peers like in India and other places, they have not rushed to this idea of just transition. They agree with it, and they want to invest in it. And I think, as Matlala has touched on, we do need to think what industries can we quickly get into so that we can be export-minded about what we're going to give out to the world. However, we need to actually be more circumspect about the agreements we're signing ourselves to, and that's what tends to worry me. That we simply are hopping into issues without really unpacking what does it mean for places like in Mpumalanga? What does it mean for places like, Limpopo, where coal is being produced? And I think this idea of simply believing, because we've never seen it in any industry where you believe that you just jump and things will automatically go in that one direction. So I think we probably need more, not a discussion in the way the president likes doing, but I think we need to be more circumspect to say, listen, this is a direction where we're doing, and this is how we're going to put the just transition. But it needs to make employment sense for South Africans. There's no use hoping you're going to get into new jobs by getting rid of the ones we currently have. So what I'm basically calling for is probably just a more open and a transparent understanding of what it means for employment's sake. If it makes no sense for employment, then I really think we shouldn't get into things that don't give us employment in the short term and also in the medium term.
Let's stay with governance matters. Matlala, public sector workers are still on strike, and I think week in, week out, I'm saying this because last week they made that initial strike. This week, again, we saw something that looked to be a slightly bigger strike. I'm not sure the impact of what the union leaders are trying to do here in order to pressure government, but nonetheless, this has not been resolved. What is going to break the back of this wage deadlock?
Well, remember that one of the concerns in our public sector and government for the past few years has been the size of our public wage bill. I think the last time I checked, our public wage bill was around 14% of our GDP, and it made about a third of our national budget, annual budget. And the concerns has been that public wage bill takes a very huge chunk from the monies that are needed to provide the services. But I always counter that and say that the challenge is not necessarily that specific ratio. Had our economy been growing at the rate that it was supposed to be, or the desired rate, that ratio would change quite drastically. But for that economy to work, we need a working public sector. And I think government has lacked political will for quite some time in terms of ensuring that we have a public service that works. The reasons that they're advancing to say, look at the ratios of our public wage bill in terms of the GDP and our public wage bill ratio in terms of our national budget is too high. And there's also been concerns that our public sector is bloated. But I'm yet to hear a convincing argument. Where exactly is our public sector bloated? For me, it's not necessarily about the monies that are spent on the public sector, but the impact of that very specific public sector. So I think with the professionalization of the public sector framework, we see that framework touches on issues such as productivity, increasing productivity within the public sector. And I think they're on the right track regarding that. Once you improve productivity within the public sector, those kind of ratios would not necessarily matter anymore. And to be fair to public sector workers, inflation is on the rise. Their salaries were frozen for quite a while. Yesterday we had an interest rate hike of 75 basis points. They get to be squeezed quite more. And in all fairness, I think each and every employee, especially in the public sector, considering that their salaries were frozen for quite some time, and 2 years ago the wage agreement was not necessarily honored, something has to give.
Yeah.
And I do believe that government will concede and actually give in to some of the demands, or rather most of the demands from the public sector unions.
TK, let's come to a different topic altogether, and the Supreme Court of Appeal ruling that the medical parole granted to former President Jacob Zuma was invalid and therefore set aside, but it left it to the Department of Correctional Services to determine the way forward as to whether or not former President should go back to jail. The department subsequently has now said it is going to appeal that. It wants to challenge that ruling. Political parties on the other end are saying, at least opposition parties are saying, this is going to be money, our money, going to waste from a department official who should ideally admit that they made a blunder and must simply correct that. How should we digest this?
Well, it's a bit of a tough one, because, yes, if we look at it blindly, to say, if you say, look, by the letter of the law, and I think the courts have ruled on it, look, it wasn't proper. It wasn't following proper processes. And I think if you actually listen to maybe other commentators, actually said, look, this is a long-standing problem, not just for the former president of the country, but just how this parole issue is handled, period. So I think maybe there needs to be a review of the whole system as a whole. Now, I think there's only two ways you can really look at it. Politically, look, it does present some challenges. But I think this is maybe a time where we need to, two things I always say when it comes to this issue. One, we need to look at how the former president got himself into this situation. It goes back to him not appearing at the Zondo Commission. He says he has his reasons why that was the case. But I think sometimes, you have to really understand that, listen, could this have been averted? And the answer is yes. So in that case, it kind of does fall upon him to say, look, you kind of found yourself in this situation. And now we have to maybe do the other consideration, which people don't want to, because it will almost look as though, some people are more, I think are more preferred than others in the eyes of the law, and that's not what we want, but we understand that that's how systems work, is that this presents a political problem. And I think there probably needs to be a discussion with the former president to say, listen, what happened legally did not follow due process. We kind of have to follow what is maybe better for the Republic. And what's better for the Republic is that we need to see that the law does apply to everyone. And I think this is where maybe you need political, I never call it leadership in South Africa, because we really don't have that. You need to have political voices speaking to the former president. Say, listen, we really do need to say, listen, some of the things which have been put, they do put us on a back foot. And we kind of come to the party and say, listen, you will follow. I think that's probably more a fear than anything else, that people are saying that he might be able to be uncomfortable about the decision that comes out with. So here, I just think political voices do need to speak to the former president to say, listen, this is going in a direction where the law is pointing us towards where we need to go. Please just obey, and let's find the means to maybe let you go serve out your time we might have to fix the time, but let's just let you figure out how you can save that time. So that, look, it's seen as though the law is working in the country.
Matlala, I wonder whether we can divorce politics on this matter, because there are those who are looking at the former president, not just his age, but sympathetically are saying he kind of like is a victim here, because it wasn't his decision to let himself out of jail. It was a decision of a correctional services official. You might want to argue whether or not they have a relationship, these two. But it's the department that has blundered here. Why should he be victimized again? I'm saying this in the eyes of those who are looking at it sympathetically on his part.
I think, Polly, as you correctly point out, a legal issue has been highly politicized, firstly. And secondly, even though those who are sympathetic to the former president might feel that it is the Department of Correctional Services that blundered, and why should the former president bear the brunt of the wrong decisions taken by the department? Ultimately, he benefited from what is an incorrect and irrational decision according to the courts. And as such, there's remedies within the legal infrastructure where the department feels that maybe the decision that they have taken was correct, and the appeal on its own might not necessarily mean that the department believes that their processes were beyond reproach, but rather seeking clarity in terms of, in future, when faced with similar challenges, how will they approach those specific challenges regarding the release of parole, especially around figures that are politically exposed. I think TK touched on the issue that this is not necessarily a new phenomenon with the former president. We have seen many prisoners before, the likes of your Tony Yangenis, your Shabir Sheikh, who were politically exposed or politically connected, that were granted parole under dubious circumstances. And I think it is actually good for the department to seek clarity and appeal the SCA judgment to ensure that going forward there is a set process and there's a clear process on how to grant those kind of parole, especially medical parole in this instance. For those that they suggest the former president should rather just go back to jail and the department is wasting money, those are political parties. It is in their very nature to take every opportune moment to score political points. But I think here we're dealing with an issue that clarity must be given, especially through the courts, legal clarity for that matter, to ensure that once we're confronted with a similar situation, there's a clear way of addressing that and that the laws are applied in accordance with the constitutional expectations.
TK, a different court matter, but it is still a parole decision matter. The Constitutional Court, very clear that the Minister of Justice was wrong in not acceding to a request to grant Janusz Walus parole. In fact, he has qualified for this dating back to 2005, and therefore within 10 days he must be let out. I want to quickly bring this to where the story has gone now, and that is the ANC and its alliance partners are saying we are going to embark on protests starting this Saturday to protest against this ruling. But I asked Pulemabe this morning, what do you plan to achieve with these protests? Are these educational about this ruling and why people should understand why the court has ruled in this matter? But he seemed to suggest that we're not going to be getting out there to explain a judgment of the Constitutional Court. It's not our space to do that. We are simply voicing our unhappiness about a decision of a court that does not take the unity of the country into cognizance. Are they correct?
It's a bit of a yes and no. Yes, in the sense that, look, I think the English playwright, I think Bernard Shaw once said about the law. He said the law is an ass, and I think he was not speaking about a body part, but the donkey. And I think in this case, it is that, because this was I think more than a legal consideration, this should have really been more of a political consideration. But I go back to the times when the South African Constitution was negotiated, and one of the parties there, the PAC, did raise the issue about the liberal nature of the South African Constitution and how it equates every human being to be the same, but seems to actually forget the historical nature of how South Africa got here. And I think the killing, the political killing of Chris Hani and what subsequent this issue of Mr. Walus, I think really does raise the issue of the ANC, I think, has been poor at trying to really put in a legal system that kind of understands truly what the South African history is as it relates to apartheid and colonialism. And I think what Mr. Pooe, when I say no to Mr. Pooe, I say this is actually on the door of the ANC. They should have really thought, how best can we actually ensure that, listen, when the minister or when the government was really writing and actually blockading this, what did they base it on? Because nowhere, and I didn't really read the judgment, but one of the issues that should have come up was his refusal to actually explain how and who supported him in actually carrying out the killing of Mr. Chris Hani. Because I think that of by itself would have really stopped the issue of this parole happening. But again, it goes back to the same thing that this was negotiated in the 90s. There was not a lot of due consideration, and many of these things are coming back to bite them. So yes, while I agree with what, in principle, what Mr. Pooe is saying, that this does present challenges for the country, I think we should always go back to how did we get here. And I always say this point that we got here because the people that negotiated at that time, as best as they could, didn't really negotiate something which really looks like it's standing up to the muster of the legal system many South Africans want.
Matlala, you have less than a minute. If the ANC and its alliance partners, colloquially, they are seen as the governing alliance, if they are saying we are protesting this judgment as leaders of society, as they like to describe themselves, is this responsible leadership?
I think we must first admit that it's not for the first time that the ANC and its alliance partners take a dig at the courts or judgments that have been issued in the past. I mean, leaders from the Tripartite Alliance and the ANC itself have previously called the courts anti-revolutionary. We had a cabinet member not so long ago writing opinion pieces indicating that the constitution and the judiciary is failing South Africans. So it's not a new thing to have leaders of the Tripartite Alliance and politicians, leaders within the ANC, cast aspersions on the courts. And in terms of whether the judgment could be divisive, certainly, law in its very nature is value-laden. It's not value neutral. But at the same time, the application of the law should not necessarily take into account the individual who's at the receiving end of that application. We are all equal before the law, and the law should be applied to the latter, and without fear or favor. So what the ANC is currently doing, they should actually express discomfort or dissatisfaction with the kind of laws that they have put in place.
Matlala Setlhalogile, let me thank you very much for your time. TK Pooe, let me thank you for your contributions to this discussion. That was News in Retrospect.